Speaker.
Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Speaker, I'd like to, it was pretty much the only choice, Chief Whip, but therefore a good one, Mr Speaker, if I might join the Whip in expressing those sentiments. Mr Speaker, let me begin with a couple of commendations. The first is to commend the member who's just resumed his seat, Craig Foss, and without being too pointed about it, many of us on this side of the House think he's a very able member. He's been a very responsible chairman of the Finance and Expenditure Committee, which is the senior select committee. We give him a hard time around the table occasionally, but he carries that with very good grace and business gets done. And it's sensible that this bill goes there. It's ironic then, sir, that the member is reading the speech as Craig Foss, not the Honourable Craig Foss, which many of us think he deserves to be, and that this is a private bill, not a government bill. But we could expect to have heard him give a speech like that as a new minister, and I think it does reflect just how concerned the government must be about the face of this government in order to have made the decisions it has on other matters. But that's for another day, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, there's another commendation here, and that is a commendation to Westpac New Zealand and their colleagues in the major banks that support the New Zealand banking industry. Whatever other comments we might make today, sir, we'd like to recognise the importance to New Zealand of having a strong and stable banking and finance sector, and we certainly believe that Westpac plays a responsible part in our financial system. Sir, the position of the Labour Party in respect to this bill is to support the Bill 2 Select Committee at this stage, and we have an open mind beyond that. We think that the fundamental purpose of the bill is appropriate, which is to vest the institutional banking business of Westpac Banking Corporation into Westpac New Zealand. Westpac New Zealand, of course, being a local branch which has been set up pursuant to the Trans-Tasman regulatory structure, whereby the New Zealand Reserve Bank plays a role as guarantor of the stability and financial integrity of the New Zealand banking system, and thereby ensures that systemically important banks are well enough and solidly enough anchored in the New Zealand market to avoid two unintended situations, of course. One would be a marginal market problem in the event of a worse cataclysm than the financial system suffered in the last few years, if that can be imagined. And we would hate to see a situation where there were not enough assets anchored in the New Zealand market to underpin its stability. And so this is a move in that direction, and we commend that. And it goes with that, sir, that it's worth repeating that the idea of having a full-service New Zealand domiciled banking regulator in the Reserve Bank is a matter that has bipartisan support around this chamber and is a very important part of our financial infrastructure. It's also a little ironic, before I move through the provisions of the bill, to see that the bill is in Mr Foss's name rather than in Nikki Kay's name, because the convention is, of course, that these bills are done in the name of the local MP. And according to Westpac's website, its head office and address for service is in central Auckland, not Hawke's Bay. So one does ask why the bills... You have got big visions for the Bay. I've got a very fond spot for the Bay, as I know the Bay does for me, and thereby I'm well acquainted with its big visions. But nonetheless, why is Nikki Kay not taking this bill? Could it be that her colleagues don't somehow trust that member to take a bill of this substance forward to the House? What is it about Nikki Kay that has meant that the government has broken with convention and not given a private bill to the member in whose electorate the head office of the entity concerned is domiciled? That is a break convention. It is a sign, unfortunately, that Nikki Kay is destined to be a one-term MP, or a one-term electorate MP anyway. And, of course, we look forward to Jacinda Ardern. Jacinda Ardern being the new MP for Auckland Central very shortly. And I'm sure that the Whips would agree. We would trust Jacinda Ardern to bring a bill such as this to the House. No problem at all. Has the smarts to do it, no question. All right, back to the legislation. It is clearly important to ensure that Westpac New Zealand Limited has a sound and stable New Zealand operation while being able to enjoy the benefits of a trans-Tasman footprint and access to global capital through its Australian-based parent. And we note the success of the Reserve Bank's local incorporation policy as one element in securing the stability of the New Zealand banking sector, and it is critical, as I said earlier, that we retain sovereign oversight of banking regulation. And the severity and speed of the 2008 financial crisis provides ample evidence of why it's important to do this. And we can accept that the transfer of assets and liabilities is best suited, given the complexity of the matter, to a vehicle such as this legislation. Sir, it's also true that on both sides of the Tasman, the banking sector is again under close scrutiny. On the other side of the ditch, the Australian Parliament has a far-reaching inquiry underway, and that brings to mind that some of the parties of the New Zealand Parliament, being Labour, the Greens and the Progressives, held an inquiry into banking issues last year. And it was a matter of regret, sir, that the government's bank, Westpac New Zealand, did not make a submission to that inquiry. It is true that some other banks made both formal and informal submissions, and it's true that when the inquiry published its finding, which was that the major banks were not passing through in full downward changes to the official cash rate into retail and wholesale interest rates, strangely enough, those margins corrected themselves within weeks of the report being released. Imagine the coincidence that those margins corrected within weeks of the report being released, saving New Zealanders tens of millions of dollars of interest. And, of course, Labour, the Greens and the Progressives were happy to play that service. We do think it's a matter of regret, however, that the government members of the Finance and Expenditure Committee repeatedly blocked, after having said that they would consider it, repeatedly blocked having a banking inquiry into the auspices of the Finance and Expenditure Committee. And there is therefore just a tinge of irony in the member that's brought this bill to the House, Mr Foss, who chairs that committee, now playing that role, other than for the reasons that I've suggested. Now, Mr Speaker, the inquiry in Australia is much broader based than the simple matter of interest rate pass-through. It is talking around a whole range of issues that are, to a lesser or greater extent, also important here. The banking ombudsperson in New Zealand has said that there are a record number of complaints to her office over the last 12 months. There is growing public concern about the banking sector. And it is none other than Westpac's own chief executive who now holds the record for being the highest paid chief executive in New Zealand, eclipsing even the CEO of Telecom. Now, I used to work with George Frazis. He's a good bloke. He's a very able executive, and there is no implied negative comment about his abilities in this. But it is also a matter of fact that the public regards any individual earning many multiples of the average salary, as the CEO of a bank like Westpac does, something that is a matter of some public concern. And so I guess our call to the banking industry would be, given the climate out there, given the fact that the New Zealand public is doing it tough, given the fact that many industries are struggling in the real economy, that our manufacturing exporters have their backs against the wall with a high exchange rate, restraint is called for. There are no plans to do an Australian-style banking inquiry in New Zealand at this time. But politicians cannot ignore the growing calls from the public to surface issues if they continue to grow. So there is a message here to the whole banking sector. Please exhibit your traditional high standards, high ethical standards and responsibility. Play your rightful role as pillars of the New Zealand business sector, pillars of the economy, pillars of society, here not only for today, but for months and years to come, and there won't be a problem. But I will say this, sir, and my final comment, and I've said it publicly, Westpac, as the government's banker, has enjoyed a privileged position The onus